The staccato burst of gunfire echoes down a Chicago street on a cold February morning in 1929. 7 men fall, their bodies torn apart by a hail of .45 caliber bullets fired from submachine guns at point-blank range. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre shocks the nation, and the weapon used, the Thompson submachine gun, becomes infamous as the symbol of gangster violence. Newspapers call it the Chicago Typewriter because of the sound it makes when firing. Editorials demand that this weapon of mass murder be banned. Law enforcement agencies scramble to acquire their own Thompsons to fight fire with fire. The manufacturer struggles to sell a weapon that was designed for trench warfare but ended up in the hands of criminals. Then, barely a decade later, that same weapon is in the hands of American soldiers storming beaches in the Pacific, paratroopers jumping into occupied France, and Marines fighting through jungles. The Thompson submachine gun, once the most notorious weapon in America, transforms into one of the most beloved firearms carried by U.S. troops in World War II. This is the story of how a weapon designed with the best intentions, rejected by the military, embraced by criminals, and vilified by the public, ultimately found redemption on the battlefields of the Second World War and became an icon of American fighting spirit. The story begins with a man named John Taliaferro Thompson, born in 1860 in Kentucky. Thompson was a career Army officer who graduated from West Point in 1882. He served in various capacities, including in the Spanish-American War, and developed a deep interest in firearms and military technology. By the early 1900s, Thompson had retired from active duty but remained deeply involved in military matters. He became convinced that modern warfare, particularly the kind of static trench warfare that was emerging in World War I, required new types of weapons. Thompson envisioned a lightweight, automatic weapon that could be carried by individual soldiers and would provide devastating close-range firepower. He called it a trench broom, a weapon that could sweep enemy trenches clear of defenders. The problem was that creating such a weapon was technically challenging. Automatic weapons existed, but they were generally heavy machine guns that required tripods or other supports and were operated by crews rather than individuals. The technology to make a lightweight automatic weapon that a single soldier could carry and fire was still being developed. Thompson partnered with a talented gun designer named John Blish, who had developed a unique breech-locking system. The Blish lock, as it was called, was based on the principle that two metal surfaces under high pressure would resist sliding against each other. Blish theorized that this principle could be used to delay the opening of the breech in an automatic weapon just long enough for pressure to drop to safe levels. In 1916, Thompson and several business partners formed the Auto Ordnance Corporation to develop and manufacture this new automatic weapon. They hired Theodore Eichhoff, a talented engineer, to turn the concepts into a working firearm. Development work progressed through 1917 and 1918, but World War I ended in November 1918 before the weapon was ready for production. This was a disaster for Auto Ordnance because the military market they had been counting on suddenly evaporated. The Army had no interest in purchasing large quantities of submachine guns with the war over. European armies, exhausted by 4 years of brutal conflict, were demobilizing and certainly were not in the market for expensive new weapons. The first production model, designated the Model 1921, finally became available in 1921. The Thompson submachine gun, as it was officially called, was a remarkable piece of engineering for its time. It fired the .45 ACP cartridge, the same round used in the M1911 pistol that had been adopted by the US Army. This was a powerful handgun cartridge, much more powerful than the smaller calibers used in most European submachine guns. The weapon operated using blowback action with the Blish-lock delay mechanism. When fired, the bolt would move rearward, but the Blish-lock would delay its opening briefly. This delay allowed pressure to drop before the bolt fully opened and the spent cartridge was ejected. A return spring would then drive the bolt forward, stripping a new round from the magazine and chambering it. As long as the trigger was held down and there was ammunition in the magazine, the weapon would continue to fire. The Thompson had several distinctive features that made it recognizable and contributed to its iconic status. The Model 1921 had a rather complex and heavy construction. It was made primarily of machined steel parts, which made it expensive to produce, but also made it robust and reliable. The weapon weighed about 10 pounds empty, which was heavy for a submachine gun. With a loaded 50-round drum magazine, it weighed over 13 pounds. The barrel was about 10.5 inches long and had a cuts compensator on the end, a device designed to reduce muzzle climb during automatic fire by directing propellant gases upward. The sights were relatively simple, a fixed front sight and an adjustable rear sight, adequate for the close ranges at which the weapon was intended to be used. The stock was a separate wooden piece that attached to the receiver. The pistol grip was also wood, and it had a distinctive vertical foregrip that protruded downward from the forend. This foregrip was designed to help control the weapon during automatic fire, though its vertical orientation was somewhat awkward and would be changed in later models. The most distinctive feature was the magazine system. The Thompson could accept either stick magazines or drum magazines. The stick magazines, which resembled those used in other automatic weapons, held 20 or 30 rounds in a single stack or double stack configuration. The drum magazines were much more distinctive and became iconic. The Type C drum held 50 rounds and the Type L drum held 100 rounds. These drums were complex mechanisms, essentially spring-wound devices where the rounds were held in a spiral configuration around a central spindle. Loading a drum magazine was time-consuming and required a special loading tool. The drums were also heavy and somewhat unreliable, prone to jamming if not loaded correctly or if they got dirty or damaged. However, they looked impressive and gave the Thompson a menacing appearance that became associated with the weapon in popular culture. The rate of fire was approximately 800 rounds per minute for the Model 1921, which meant that a 50-round drum would be emptied in less than 4 seconds if fired on full automatic. This high rate of fire made the weapon devastating at close range, but also meant ammunition consumption was rapid. The cyclic rate could be adjusted somewhat by changing springs and other components, and later models had slightly different rates of fire. The effective range of the Thompson was limited by the ballistics of the .45 ACP cartridge. This cartridge was designed for pistols, not rifles, and it was subsonic, meaning the bullet traveled slower than the speed of sound. The heavy .45 caliber bullet, weighing 230 grains in standard military loading, had good stopping power at close range, but lost velocity and energy quickly. The effective range of the Thompson was generally considered to be about 50 to 100 yards, beyond which accuracy and energy dropped off significantly. This made the Thompson primarily a close-quarters weapon, ideal for urban combat, building clearing, and jungle fighting, but not suitable for longer-range engagements. Auto Ordnance attempted to market the Thompson to law enforcement and military customers. They demonstrated the weapon to various agencies and produced promotional materials emphasizing its firepower and effectiveness. However, the price was a major obstacle. The Model 1921 Thompson cost about $200, which in 1920s money was extremely expensive. For comparison, a standard military rifle might cost $20 to $30, and a quality commercial rifle might cost $50 to $100. The Thompson cost as much as a good used car. This high price was due to the manufacturing process, which involved extensive machining of steel parts. There were no stamped parts or shortcuts in the Model 1921. Everything was machined from solid steel billets, which was time-consuming and expensive. Most law enforcement agencies could not afford Thompsons in any quantity, and the military market remained closed. The U.S. Army had huge stockpiles of rifles and other weapons left over from World War I and saw no need for submachine guns. European militaries were similarly uninterested. Auto Ordnance found itself with an inventory of expensive weapons and few buyers. The company struggled financially, and production remained low through the 1920s. Then Prohibition happened. The 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages, went into effect in 1920. Almost immediately, a massive black market for alcohol emerged. Organized crime groups, which had existed before Prohibition but were relatively small-scale, suddenly had access to enormous profits from bootlegging. These criminal organizations needed weapons to protect their operations, to fight rival gangs, and to intimidate or eliminate witnesses and law enforcement officials who could not be bribed. The Thompson submachine gun was available for purchase through sporting goods stores and by mail order. There were no federal restrictions on automatic weapons at the time. If you had $200 and wanted a Thompson, you could buy one legally with no background check, no waiting period, and no registration. For wealthy gangsters flush with bootlegging profits, $200 was not an obstacle. The Thompson offered capabilities that no other readily available weapon could match. A gangster with a Thompson could fire 50 rounds in a few seconds, overwhelming any opposition. The psychological impact was enormous. The sound of a Thompson firing was distinctive and terrifying. Victims had no chance to react or take cover. Criminal use of the Thompson began appearing in newspapers in the mid-1920s. Bank robberies, gang shootouts, and assassinations increasingly involved Thompsons. The weapon became associated with organized crime, particularly with Chicago gangs during the height of Prohibition violence. Al Capone's organization is believed to have acquired multiple Thompson submachine guns, as did rival gangs. The Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, where 7 members of the Bugs Moran gang were lined up against a wall and machine gunned to death, became the most infamous example of Thompson use by criminals. The killers, dressed as police officers, used Thompson submachine guns to execute the victims. The brutality of the massacre and the effectiveness of the weapon in carrying it out shocked the nation. The media coverage of gangster violence featuring Thompsons was extensive and sensational. Newspapers ran stories with headlines about machine gun murders and Tommy gun massacres. The weapon was given colorful nicknames: the Chicago typewriter, the Chicago piano, the chopper, the trench sweeper. These nicknames reflected both the sound the weapon made and its association with Chicago gangsters. Photographs of crime scenes showing bullet-riddled cars and buildings, all from Thompson fire, became common. The Thompson became a symbol of the lawlessness and violence of the Prohibition-era. This association with crime was devastating for auto ordnance. While criminal purchases provided some revenue, they also made legitimate law enforcement and military sales more difficult. Police departments that did purchase Thompsons were sometimes criticized for using gangster weapons. The public perception of the Thompson was overwhelmingly negative. Editorial writers called for the weapon to be banned. Congress held hearings on regulating automatic weapons and other firearms. This eventually led to the National Firearms Act of 1934, which imposed heavy taxes and registration requirements on machine guns, short-barreled rifles and shotguns, and suppressors. The act was specifically designed to make it difficult and expensive for criminals to acquire weapons like the Thompson. The 1934 Act required anyone purchasing a machine gun to pay a $200 tax, which was the same as the cost of the weapon itself, effectively doubling the price. They also had to submit fingerprints, photographs, and paperwork to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms for approval, a process that could take months. Law enforcement officials did not have to pay the tax, which allowed police departments to acquire Thompsons while making it much harder for criminals to do so legally. Of course, by this time, many criminals already had Thompsons and illegal sales continued, but the act did make it more difficult. While the Thompson was gaining notoriety in America, it was also seeing limited use overseas. The Irish Republican Army obtained some Thompsons in the 1920s and used them in their conflict against British forces. Some were shipped to China, where various warlords and factions fighting in the Chinese Civil War used them. The weapon appeared in various conflicts around the world in small numbers, but it never achieved large-scale military adoption. The high cost remained a barrier, and most militaries still did not see a need for submachine guns. Throughout the 1930s, auto ordnance continued to struggle. They made some sales to law enforcement agencies, particularly FBI and Treasury agents who were fighting organized crime and needed firepower to match what the criminals had. The famous FBI shootout with gangsters John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, and others often involved Thompsons on both sides. FBI agents became proficient with the weapon and advocated for its use. Police departments in major cities, where organized crime was most prevalent, also acquired Thompsons despite the public relations challenges. Auto ordnance attempted to reduce costs and improve the design. They introduced the Model 1928, which had some simplified features and a slightly reduced rate of fire, about 600 to 700 rounds per minute instead of 800. The lower rate of fire made the weapon more controllable and reduced ammunition consumption. However, the manufacturing process was still expensive because it still relied heavily on machining. The Model 1928 could accept both stick and drum magazines, though the military and law enforcement customers increasingly preferred the simpler and more reliable stick magazines. Then came World War II, and everything changed. Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, beginning the war in Europe. Britain and France declared war on Germany but were ill-prepared for the conflict. The German military using blitzkrieg tactics, rapidly overran Poland, then turned west in 1940 and conquered France in just 6 weeks. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, facing the threat of invasion. The British military had suffered heavy losses in France, including the loss of enormous amounts of equipment abandoned at Dunkirk. Britain needed weapons desperately, and they needed them quickly. The British purchased everything they could get their hands on, including large numbers of Thompson submachine guns. Ordnance finally had a large customer willing to buy in quantity. The British ordered thousands of Thompsons and put them into service with their troops. However, the British quickly identified issues with the weapon. The drum magazines were unreliable and heavy, and soldiers disliked them. The vertical foregrip was awkward. The weapon was heavy. The manufacturing cost was still high, and production could not be scaled up quickly enough to meet demand. The British needed hundreds of thousands of submachine guns, and the Thompson simply could not be produced that quickly or cheaply with its complex design. This led to the development of the British Sten gun, a much simpler and cheaper submachine gun that could be mass-produced quickly. The Sten was crude compared to the Thompson, but it worked. It was cheap, and it could be produced in huge numbers. This should have been a warning to ordnance about the limitations of the Thompson's design, but at that moment, they were focused on ramping up production to meet British orders. The United States began preparing for possible entry into the war in 1940 and 1941. The military was expanding, and the army began to reconsider weapons it had previously rejected. The combat reports from Europe showed that submachine guns were useful in certain roles, particularly for paratroopers, tank crews, and other soldiers who needed a compact weapon with more firepower than a pistol but less bulk than a rifle. The army began acquiring Thompsons in 1940, ordering them in significant quantities. However, the army immediately encountered the same issues the British had identified. The Thompson was too expensive and too slow to manufacture. The complex Blish lock mechanism, which had never actually been necessary since the weapon would function just fine as a simple blowback design, was eliminated to simplify production. The drum magazines were dropped in favor of stick magazines only. The elaborate adjustable sights were replaced with simpler fixed sights. The finely machined components were redesigned where possible to use simpler manufacturing methods. The cuts compensator was simplified. The result was the M1 Thompson, introduced in 1942, which was a simplified version that was cheaper and faster to produce, though still not as cheap or simple as weapons like the Sten or the later M3 grease gun. The M1 Thompson eliminated the drum magazine completely. It used only 20 or 30 round stick magazines. The vertical foregrip was replaced with a conventional horizontal foregrip. The rate of fire was reduced to about 600 rounds per minute. The weapon retained the basic design and reliability of earlier Thompsons, but was significantly easier to manufacture. Even with these simplifications, the Thompson was still more expensive and time-consuming to produce than competing designs, but the Army had committed to it. Production lines were established, and changing to a different weapon would cause delays. The M1A1 Thompson, introduced in 1943, simplified things even further. The firing pin was fixed to the bolt face rather than being a separate component. The actuator, a part involved in the firing mechanism, was simplified. More parts were made from stampings rather than markings where possible. These changes reduced production time and cost without significantly affecting reliability or performance. The M1A1 became the standard production model for the remainder of the war. American soldiers and Marines first used the Thompson in combat in significant numbers in the Pacific Theater. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought the United States into the war, and within months, American forces were engaged in combat across the Pacific. The Thompson proved ideal for the close-quarters fighting that characterized much of the Pacific War. Jungle terrain, limited visibility, and engagement ranges. Combat often occurred at ranges of 50 yards or less, well within the Thompson's effective range. The weapon's firepower was devastating at these ranges. Marines landing on Guadalcanal in August 1942 carried Thompsons. They found the weapon extremely effective in the dense jungle. Japanese infantry tactics often involved close-range ambushes and nighttime infiltration attacks. The Thompson gave American troops a significant advantage in these situations. A Marine with a Thompson could lay down a high volume of fire in a few seconds, suppressing or killing multiple attackers. The psychological effect on the Japanese was significant as well. The sound of Thompson fire, which the Japanese troops had not previously encountered, was distinctive and alarming. One of the challenges in the Pacific was the weight of the Thompson. In the heat and humidity of the tropics, carrying a 10-pound weapon plus ammunition was exhausting. Soldiers and Marines often had to march long distances through difficult terrain, and every pound of weight mattered. The Thompson was heavier than the M1 Garand rifle, which weighed about 9.5 pounds, and much heavier than the M1 carbine, which weighed only 5.5 pounds. However, those who carried it felt the weight was worth it for the firepower it provided. Ammunition consumption was another issue. The high rate of fire meant that Thompson gunners could go through their ammunition very quickly. Each 30-round magazine gave only about 3 seconds of continuous fire. In practice, soldiers were trained to fire in short bursts rather than continuous streams, which conserved ammunition and was more accurate. But even firing in bursts, a firefight could consume several magazines quickly. Soldiers carrying Thompsons also had to carry extra magazines, and each loaded 30-round magazine weighed about a pound. Carrying 10 magazines meant 10 pounds of ammunition, in addition to the weapon itself. In the European theater, the Thompson saw extensive use after the American landings in North Africa in November 1942. The terrain and fighting in North Africa was different from the Pacific. There were more open spaces and longer engagement ranges, where the Thompson was less useful. However, in urban combat, in fighting through villages and towns, the Thompson was valuable. As the campaign moved into Sicily in 1943, and then Italy, urban combat became more common, and the Thompson's utility increased. The D-Day landings in June 1944 and the subsequent fighting in France saw heavy Thompson use. Paratroopers were equipped with Thompsons because the weapon was more compact than a rifle, easier to carry during a parachute jump, and provided excellent firepower for the close-range fighting that paratroopers often encountered. The famous photograph of paratroopers boarding aircraft before D-Day often shows soldiers with Thompsons slung across their chests. Rangers and other assault troops also carried Thompsons for the extra firepower during the initial assault phases. In urban combat, which became increasingly common As the Allies fought through French cities and eventually into Germany, the Thompson was extremely effective. Room clearing, fighting in buildings, urban street fighting, all of these scenarios favored the Thompson's high rate of fire and close-range effectiveness. A soldier clearing a room did not want to be fumbling with a long rifle. The Thompson was easier to maneuver in tight spaces, and its firepower could quickly neutralize threats. Tankers, armored vehicle crews, were often issued Thompsons or M3 submachine guns because they needed a weapon for self-defense if they had to abandon their vehicle, but they did not have space inside the tank for full-length rifles. The Thompson was compact enough to store in a tank, but powerful enough to be effective if the crew had to fight dismounted. The German forces, for their part, respected the Thompson. German soldiers who encountered it recognized it as a formidable weapon. They had their own submachine guns, primarily the MP-40, which was an excellent weapon in its own right, lighter and simpler than the Thompson, but firing the less powerful 9 Parabellum cartridge rather than the .45 ACP. In close-range encounters, the Thompson's heavier bullet gave it an edge in stopping power, though the MP-40's lighter weight and larger magazine capacity were advantages in other situations. One of the aspects of the Thompson that soldiers appreciated was its reliability. Despite its complex origins, the weapon was robust and could function in difficult conditions. It could get muddy, wet, or sandy, and with basic cleaning, it would continue to function. This reliability was crucial in combat, where a weapon malfunction could be fatal. Soldiers learned to maintain their Thompsons, to clean them regularly, to inspect magazines for damage, and the weapon rewarded that care with consistent performance. The Thompson also had good accuracy for a submachine gun, at least within its effective range. The heavy weight helped to dampen recoil and keep the weapon steady during automatic fire. The relatively low rate of fire compared to some other submachine guns made it easier to fire in controlled bursts. A trained soldier could keep a burst on target at ranges out to 50 or even 75 yards, which was good performance for a weapon firing from an open bolt in full automatic. However, the Thompson was not without its problems. The weight was consistently mentioned as a drawback. Soldiers wished the weapon was lighter, particularly when they had to carry it for long periods. The stick magazines, while more reliable than the drums, were still prone to damage. If a magazine was dented or the feed lips were bent, it would not feed reliably. Soldiers learned to be careful with their magazines, but in combat, magazines got dropped, stepped on, and abused. Having spare magazines was essential, but it added weight. The limited range was another issue. In open terrain where engagements occurred at ranges beyond 100 yards, the Thompson was almost useless. The .45 ACP bullet simply did not have the velocity or the trajectory to be effective at those ranges. This was not a flaw in the weapon because it was never designed for long-range use, but it did mean that Thompson-armed soldiers were vulnerable in certain tactical situations. The high cost of the Thompson, even in its simplified M1A1 form, led the Army to seek a replacement. The M3 submachine gun, nicknamed the grease gun because it resembled a mechanic's grease gun, was introduced in 1943. The M3 was designed from the ground up for cheap, rapid production. It was made almost entirely from stamped metal parts welded together. It fired the same .45 ACP cartridge as the Thompson, but had a much slower rate of fire, about 450 rounds per minute, which actually made it easier to control and more economical with ammunition. The M3 cost about $20 to manufacture compared to about $70 for an M1A1 Thompson, and it could be produced much more quickly. The Army began replacing Thompsons with M3s in 1943 and 1944, but the transition was gradual. Many units continued to use Thompsons throughout the war, and soldiers who had Thompsons often preferred to keep them rather than switch to the new M3. The Thompson had a proven track record, and soldiers trusted it. The M3, despite being cheaper and in some ways more practical, did not have the same reputation or the same feel. Many soldiers felt the Thompson was a more substantial, more reliable weapon. The Marines, in particular, seemed to retain Thompsons longer than the Army. Marine Corps units fighting in the Pacific in 1944 and 1945, in battles like Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, still had significant numbers of Thompsons. The Marines had come to see the Thompson as one of their signature weapons, along with the M1 Garand rifle. The image of a Marine with a Thompson became iconic, appearing in photographs, newsreels, and recruitment posters. Production numbers for the Thompson during World War II were substantial. Approximately 1.5 million Thompson submachine guns of all models were produced during the war years. This included M1928A1 models, M1 models, and M1A1 models. The primary manufacturers were Auto Ordnance and Savage Arms Company, which produced Thompsons under contract. This was a far cry from the few thousand produced during the 1920s and 1930s. The war had transformed the Thompson from a commercial failure to a mass-produced military weapon. The Thompson also saw use by Allied forces beyond the United States. The British continued to use Thompsons throughout the war, though they also used their own Sten guns in larger numbers. The Soviet Union received Thompsons through Lend-Lease, though they were not a major part of Soviet armament. The Soviets had their own submachine guns, particularly the PPSH-41, which they produced in enormous quantities. Chinese forces fighting against the Japanese also received Thompsons, as did various resistance groups in occupied Europe. The French resistance used Thompsons that were airdropped to them by the Allies. These weapons, along with plastic explosives, radios, and other supplies, helped resistance fighters conduct sabotage and guerrilla operations against German occupation forces. The Thompson's firepower was particularly valued in ambushes and hit-and-run attacks. A small group of resistance fighters with Thompsons could attack a German patrol or convoy, inflict heavy casualties in a few seconds, and then disperse before German reinforcements arrived. One of the interesting aspects of the Thompson's military service was how its gangster reputation actually became an asset rather than a liability. The weapon that had been associated with Al Capone and crime now became associated with heroic American soldiers fighting fascism. The media, which had once condemned the Thompson as a murder weapon, now celebrated it as a tool of liberation. Magazine articles and newsreels showed soldiers with Thompsons storming enemy positions. The weapon appeared in films and propaganda materials. The Thompson's distinctive appearance made it easily recognizable, and it became a symbol of American military power. Soldiers gave their Thompsons names and personalized them. Some carved notches in the stock, supposedly representing enemy kills, though this practice was more common in movies than in reality. Some added unofficial markings or paint. The weapon became not just a tool but a companion, something that soldiers relied on and formed an attachment to. This was common with all weapons, but the Thompson, with its weight, its distinctive appearance, and its reputation, seemed to inspire particularly strong feelings among those who carried it. The sound of the Thompson firing became one of the iconic sounds of World War II. Newsreel footage from the war often featured the distinctive rapid-fire chatter of Thompsons. This sound, which had once been associated with gangster violence, was now associated with American soldiers fighting for freedom. The psychological transformation was complete. The weapon had been redeemed. After World War II, the Thompson continued in service for some time. The U.S. military retained stocks of Thompsons, and they were used in the Korean War, which began in 1950. However, by this time, the Thompson was increasingly seen as obsolete. The M3 submachine gun had largely replaced it in Army service, and there was interest in developing new infantry weapons. The development of intermediate cartridges and select-fire rifles, which could function as both rifles and automatic weapons, pointed to the future of infantry armament. The Thompson was gradually phased out of U.S. military service in the 1950s and 1960s, though some remained in use with Reserve and National Guard units for years. Many Thompsons were given to Allied nations through military aid programs, and the weapon continued to appear in conflicts around the world. Some law enforcement agencies in the United States continued to use Thompsons into the 1970s, valuing them for their reliability and firepower in hostage rescue and other tactical situations. Today, original Thompson submachine guns are highly collectible. Because they were manufactured before 1986, when new machine guns were banned from civilian ownership in the United States, legal transferable Thompsons can still be owned by civilians who comply with federal regulations. These weapons sell for thousands of dollars, far more than their original price, because of their historical significance and their limited availability. Semi-automatic replicas of the Thompson are also manufactured, allowing shooters to own and fire Thompson-style weapons without the regulations and expense associated with actual machine guns. The Thompson appears frequently in films, television shows, and video games set in the World War II era or the 1920s and 1930s. Its distinctive appearance makes it instantly recognizable, and filmmakers use it to establish period authenticity. The weapon has become so iconic that it is almost a character in its own right in some productions, symbolizing either gangster violence in crime dramas or American heroism in war films. The legacy of the Thompson is complex. It was designed with good intentions by a man who wanted to help soldiers in combat. It was a technical achievement, incorporating innovative features and demonstrating excellent craftsmanship. But it was also expensive, heavy, and difficult to manufacture, which limited its military adoption initially. Its association with gangster violence nearly destroyed the company that made it and gave the weapon a terrible reputation. Then war came, and the Thompson found its true calling. Despite its limitations, it proved to be an effective combat weapon, and soldiers who used it generally regarded it highly. The Thompson's transformation from gangster gun to military icon reflects broader changes in American society and in warfare. The Prohibition era and the violence associated with it seem like a distant, almost quaint period of lawlessness compared to the global conflagration of World War II. The Thompson, which had been a symbol of that earlier violence, became a symbol of the fight against fascism and tyranny. The weapon that had mowed down gangsters in Chicago alleyways now helped to liberate Europe and the Pacific. The design philosophy behind the Thompson, emphasizing reliability and firepower over portability and economy, was very much a product of its time. Modern military small arms emphasize lightweight, large magazine capacity, and controllability in automatic fire. The Thompson, with its 10-pound weight and 30-round magazines, seems almost quaint by modern standards. But in its day, it represented a significant leap in infantry firepower, and it helped to establish the submachine gun as a valuable category of military weapon. The soldiers who carried the Thompson in World War II are nearly all gone now. The youngest veterans of that war are in their late 90s, and their numbers dwindle each year. But the Thompson remains as a physical reminder of their service. Museums display Thompsons alongside other artifacts of the war. Historical reenactors carry replica Thompsons at events commemorating battles. The weapon connects us to that generation and to the sacrifices they made. The story of the Thompson is ultimately a story about how technology, society, and history intersect in unexpected ways. A weapon designed for one purpose ended up being used for something entirely different. A commercial failure became a military success. A symbol of crime became a symbol of heroism. The Thompson submachine guns journey from the drawing boards of auto-ordnance through the streets of Prohibition-era Chicago to the battlefields of World War II is one of the most unlikely and fascinating stories in firearms history. It demonstrates that the meaning and significance of an object can change dramatically based on who uses it and for what purpose. The Thompson was the same weapon in the hands of gangsters as it was in the hands of soldiers, but its meaning could not have been more different. In the hands of criminals, it was an instrument of murder and terror. In the hands of American servicemen fighting against fascism, it was an instrument of liberation and justice. That transformation, that redemption, is what makes the story of the Thompson so compelling, and why the weapon remains such an enduring symbol of both a dark chapter in American domestic history and the finest hour of American military service.